Hey, my name is David Williams, and I'm shooting this video to talk about the book of Habakkuk today, and just to lay out where we're headed. My intentions for the video is that I want to start by laying out the context of the book and even the structure of the book that the book follows, and then from there I want to talk about how this book points us to Christ, and then I'll finish the video by talking about how this book and the biblical principles that we can pull from this book apply to us today. And so just starting with the context of the book, Habakkuk was a prophet that lived around 600 BC during the final days of the southern kingdom of Judah. And during his time, there was a lot of spiritual corruption. There was a lot of violence and oppression and injustice happening everywhere. Also, the kingdom of Judah has experienced and seen the consequences of the northern kingdom of Israel, who has been attacked and conquered and oppressed by the Assyrians. And so the prophets of the time, the major prophet of the time would be Jeremiah, but the prophets of the time were very concerned that Judah was heading in the same direction. And this is a unique book because for the most part, the other prophet books, specifically the minor prophet books, are God speaking to the people through a prophet. But this is a little unique because what we're seeing in the book of Habakkuk is actually a back and forth between Habakkuk and God. And there's multiple times where they're going back and forth, and we're very much watching a dialogue between a prophet and Yahweh. And so knowing that, just want to start by giving you a snapshot of the structure of the book and what actually happens. It's a short book for us. In modern day, we're seeing a 3-chapter book, but it's actually broken up into 5 sections, and the book starts with Habakkuk crying out to God about Judah's sins and about the reality that his people were living and how they were acting. And then from there we go into the second section, still in the first chapter, where God answers. And when he answers by letting Habakkuk know that he is going to respond to the sins of the people of Judah by allowing the Babylonians to come in and conquer and oppress them. And so from there we go into the third section, which it's at the end of chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2, where Habakkuk responds by wrestling again. But now he's wrestling with God's answer, and he's really revealing to God that he feels like that response isn't fair, doesn't make sense, because the Babylonians are worse than the Israelites. And so here he's just wrestling with God. How could you use a tool of someone that's more wicked than us to punish us, you know? And so he's really dealing with that. It seems like the cure is worse than the disease. And so God responds in the 4th section of the book by letting him know and giving him this vision of justice and faith. And from there, we see a dramatic change, because in the 5th and last section of the book, Habakkuk responds with a prayer and a song of trust and of worship. And so really powerful book. But as all of the Old Testament is, it points to Jesus. And so from a Christ-centric theology point of view, just want to take a second and point out 3 areas where this book clearly points to Christ. And the first one is really just zooming in on one verse, because in Habakkuk 2:4, there's a statement that's made that says, the righteous will live by faith. The righteous will live by faith. And this is very much a verse that lays out for us the doctrine of justification by faith. Justification by faith. And Paul honestly builds his doctrine of justification on this verse. In fact, he quotes it several times. He quotes it in Romans chapter 1, verse 17. He quotes it again in Galatians chapter 3, verse 11. And then, there's scholarly debate about who wrote Hebrews. I am on the side that believes that Paul did not write Hebrews. But for the sake of argument, I will just say that the author of Hebrews also quotes this verse, and even quotes it more in detail in Hebrews 10:38. And just simply put, Habakkuk's world was collapsing around him, and God told him that righteousness wouldn't come through sight, it wouldn't come through certainty, it wouldn't come through circumstances, it would come by faith. And that's very much the the ground by which the gospel is built upon. And then the second place where we can see that this book points to Jesus is just the reality that Jesus is the fulfillment of that faith call. He was the righteous one who had perfect faith in the Father. He was the one who suffered injustice and violence and did not lose his faith. But ultimately, in him, in Christ, we receive righteousness by faith. We receive righteousness by faith in Christ. And our hope is not anchored to a circumstance. Our hope is anchored to the person of Jesus Christ, who he is and what he did. And so it points to Christ through the reality of the righteous will live by faith, through the fact that Jesus is the fulfillment of that faith call. And then lastly, the book of Habakkuk and the movement by which Habakkuk moves through the book in his own heart mirrors the gospel. He moves from confusion to faith. He moves from the problem of evil to trusting in God's plan, and the gospel does the same thing. It takes people who are lost and blinded by sin and confusion, and it moves them to a place of trust and faith in him that changes everything. And so, knowing that, I want to take the last couple minutes here and talk about how we can apply this practically to our lives today. And there's actually 5 things I want to give you, and the first one I just gave you. We can apply this to our life by just understanding the reality that we are justified through our faith. We are made righteous through our faith in Christ and in God's plan. But the second one is a little bit more practical, and really all 4 of these are in just the scope of the entire book. And the first one is that Habakkuk teaches us that we can bring our questions to God. We can wrestle with God. God's not intimidated by our honest lament or by our doubt. In fact, all through the Bible, we see God responding positively to his people wrestling with him from an honest place in their heart. And so Habakkuk shows us that. He wrestles with God, and God moves him patiently along a journey. And so we can see through the book that we can bring our questions to God. The second thing that we can see is that faith is learned in waiting. It's learned in waiting. God's promises are good, but we often have to be willing to wait for them. And in the book, we actually see where in God's second response to Habakkuk, God tells him, write this down on a tablet, because this revelation, this truth that I'm about to give you is not going to come to fruition until an appointed time. And so right off the bat, we're seeing God preparing Habakkuk to wait. And we now know on this side of reality that Habakkuk, it was 600 more years before that thing that God was promising, that justification through faith, would not come to fruition for another 600 years. And so the waiting that Habakkuk was being told to sit in was going to be longer than his earthly life. And so we just know that we have got to be willing to wait on God's promises. The fourth thing is that we can see in this book is that we've got to trust God even when we don't understand. Faith is not choosing stability in what's happening around us. It's choosing stability in the character and the promises of God. And John Piper says it this way, talking about Habakkuk. He says, when judgment comes, the just shall live by his faith. Habakkuk taught that the only thing that can save us is faith. And here's the truth about the book. Chapter 3 is such a dramatically different tone. The things that Habakkuk was saying was dramatically different. But here's the truth. Nothing in Habakkuk's world had changed. Nothing had changed. In fact, the only thing that we now know is that it was going to get worse, and Habakkuk knew it. And so nothing had changed for the positive. What had changed was Habakkuk, was his heart, was his faith had grown. And we can see that in his response. He didn't come to an understanding. His heart changed, and he moved to a place of trust and faith. And God gently took him along that journey. And so we can learn that we can trust in God even when we don't understand. And then the last thing, as I close, is that worship is our response, not our escape. Habakkuk goes to the watchtower as he's wrestling, but then the moment that he finishes wrestling, he goes into worship. And I just want to finish by pointing out one of the most famous verses in the book, and it comes from chapter 3, verse 17, and this is how Habakkuk's heart had changed and the posture that he had at the end of the book. He says, though the fig tree does not bud. Okay, and then it lists off several more things that may not happen. Okay, crops not coming, all these different things happening, everything collapsing. Though the fig tree does not bud, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. And the list of things that he lists off in this verse are all 600 BC problems, 600 BC challenges. But for us today, we can insert any challenge. Okay, even though there's corruption in our world, even though the political landscape is scary, even though there's war and violence and poverty, maybe even we can zoom in on our own life, on our own families, even though that marriage that I'm fighting for and believing for is still on the rocks, even though that child's diagnosis has still not gotten better, whatever it is, even though, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. It's our response. Worship is our response, and we can learn that and apply it from the book of Habakkuk. Thank you.